An excruciatingly long day full of fear and anxiety passed before we heard back from Rebecca. She had messaged us asking to meet in person after we described our situation in detail, but warned us in advance that she does not know how helpful she would be. The drive to the address she'd given to us was about an hour and a half away in Augusta, where she had a small apartment she was staying at currently. Connor and I walked to the hotel to find my car still there, but his had disappeared. We kept a close eye on our wounds and bruises, unsure of what they actually were, and if they could spread, we were relieved to see they still hadn't. I'd like to say we discussed theories and possible reasons for why this was happening, and why to us, but we were so afraid and exhausted by now that we barely said anything to each other. I'd spoken to my family on the phone earlier and had to pretend everything was okay, when deep down I wanted to cry into the receiver and to my mother and ask her what to do. Anything we tried to find regarding the missing police officers who responded to the call that night online was met with old articles that, coincidentally, had some of the same keywords I'd used in my search. There was nothing on the news either. It was as if nothing had happened at all. We arrived in Augusta a little after noon and turned from the main street to town into another narrow road that led to Rebecca's neighborhood. We climbed up to the 3rd floor and rung her bell, footsteps approaching the door a few moments later and stopping, presumably looking through the large peephole before she opened the door to greet us. What we saw in person was a woman slightly older than the one on the website, so I assumed the photo must have been taken some years ago. "Good afternoon. I assume you're Marielle and Connor?" She pushed the door open fully now and looked at me first, then at him. "Yes, thank you for having us, Miss Simmons. We're not sure who we can even turn to about this." Connor nodded and then brought his head down slightly as if admitting defeat. "Nobody, I hate to tell you. You're not the first to come to me about something like this, but you're probably the only ones to have..." She seemed hesitant to finish her sentence, but did so after a brief pause. "Survive." Connor and I turned to meet our eyes and Rebecca invited us in, apologizing for saying what she did and shut the door behind us once we'd entered. She went to make us coffee while we took our shoes and jackets off and made ourselves comfortable in her living room, and I tried taking some of the stress off by petting her puppy, a French bulldog that couldn't have been older than a few months. "They allow pets in the building?" I tried initiating small talk when she came back to set a friendlier tone before we got to what we were really here for. "You can say that. Honestly, the owner is against any animals of any kind in the apartments, but I convinced him how little trouble he'd cause and that if he broke or damaged anything, I'd pay back in full. Isn't that right, Frankie?" In response, Frankie mustered up a semi-bark and licked her hand as she went to pet his head, and then sat down on the opposite side of the sofa me and Connor were on a small cushioned chair. "I know who you are, Marielle." I must admit that phrase almost sent me into fight or flight, considering I've been on edge to say the least for the past a little over 2 days and was ready to jump up and run out of the apartment, but she continued just in time to allow me to prevent myself from doing so. "Your husband contacted me a year ago, trying to find out more about the mirror world and the creatures inhabiting it. I'm sorry to hear what happened and that you had to relive it writing in the email." Her mentioning my ex-husband's death was a gut punch as I still hadn't even started processing it over the weight of everything that's happened, and I stared blankly at her. Connor noticed and took over the conversation for me. "Did he mention anything we might need to know? Why was he trying to break into Marielle's home?" Rebecca took a sip from her coffee, which still had steam coming off of it, and switched her gaze to me, picking up Frankie off the floor once he jumped off as soon as I stopped petting him, obviously completely disinterested in me now, and set him in her lap. "Because he was afraid of exactly what is happening to you. I can't put this in any other way, so I will be forward about it. Russell did not seem exactly in his right mind, even back then. He was talking about all kinds of theories and supposed discoveries he had made that sounded like the ravings of a madman, but what was evident to me was his duty to protect you from it, Marielle. I assume that's why he was there that night, but he was unlucky enough to encounter something that only appeared to be you." Both Connor and I were at a loss for words at how casually this woman seemed to be talking about this, As if it was an everyday occurrence that some body snatchers who apparently lived in your damn mirror or something like that took over your life and pretended to be you. But that didn't stop her from continuing. Admittedly, though, he was one of the few to actually come to me with more than just claims of there being another version of them. So what the hell are these things? Why are they targeting us? Connor said, not even having touched his coffee yet. Not that I did either. I don't know for sure how they choose their hosts, as I call them, but from what Russell and others before and after him have told me, is that they form when you feel lost for an extended period of time in your life, like when a piece of you seems to be missing. Is that description accurate for you after your divorce, Marielle? Part of me was getting more and more furious at how confidently this woman was trying to gouge the low points in my life, but I could not bring myself to go against her when everything she'd been saying so far was correct. And it didn't help that she sounded so confident. Well, maybe it did, because we were finally talking to someone who not only believed us, but seemed experienced in the topic at hand. It does. And I guess the same goes for Russell. He started talking about all this a month after his father passed in a tragic work accident. I thought he was just taking the loss really bad, but... my God. I took a moment to think everything through and allowed myself to finally take a sip from the coffee Rebecca had made me before continuing. You said he had made some kind of discovery when he come to you. What were you talking about? Well, I don't know if your husband had ever come into contact with any of them, but according to him, the only way to sever these beings' connection to you was to destroy them in their own world. I'll be honest that I was up until very recently skeptical about its existence as a whole, considering no one had actually ever been to it, or at least done that and returned to tell the tale. But here you two are. And you have evidence. She held her hand up to her ribcage while also looking at my ankle, referring to the dark marks Connor and I had. I'm sure he felt as unnerved as I did at the mention of them. And what do these markings mean? Do you know? Connor joined in. My theory is that it's this other reality's way to manifest itself into our own. I can't tell you what that means or how dangerous it may be, but I hope nobody has to find out. She put Frankie back on the ground and he tried to get her attention again by scratching on her left leg for a second before making a sound like an angry toddler and curling up by her feet. Then Rebecca leaned on her knees and her eyes darted from Connor's to mine and back. I know that this will sound like suicide, but you were already there once. You twice even, Connor. And you both managed to escape. In all my time following this phenomenon, I've not heard or met anyone to have done that. I'd say that it's your decision if you wanted to do this, but with those marks you have, I'm not sure if you have any choice in the matter if you want to stay. You must go back and destroy your imposters before they claim you. I don't have to explain how hard my stomach dropped as if we were literally instructed to go back into that damn maze that took the form of my home. But at the same time, there was no other solution we could think of, and I'm sure it had been floating around Connor's head as much as it had been mine recently. But how do we even go about doing it? We don't know what they even are. How are we supposed to fight them? My voice trembled at the mention of a confrontation with them. We don't call them mirror people just because we came up with it randomly, Marielle. You came out of that world through your mirror. You see how they are trying to become you slowly. So? Rebecca stood up and walked over to one of the walls of the apartment that had a large rectangular mirror on it. My guess is that attacking them with glass will be effective in hurting and potentially killing them. Your guess? Connor stood up and I felt the disbelief in his words, as if they were my own. You're telling us to enter whatever that place is again, most likely walking straight to our death or, God knows, maybe something even worse, and all you have to go off of is your guess? She turned back to face him, seemingly unaffected by his demeanor, and crossed her arms before speaking. Like I said, I've never encountered one of them myself, and I'm only going off of what I've heard by people I've spoken to, both in person and through my forum. If it makes you feel better, I am more than willing to come with you. I've been investigating this for far too long, and I want to be able to help others in your situation, if they ever come to find me. So you're saying this just isn't happening to me? It's a whole phenomenon? When was the first time something like this happened? I can't tell you for sure, Marielle. Rebecca shrugged, and now turned her whole body to face us, and Connor shook his head while sitting down but remained silent. But you are not the only one being haunted by yourself. You might realize now, though, why it's not a widespread threat. People who look for help from those not familiar with it end up ostracized or thrown into mental hospitals. We stayed at Rebecca's apartment for another half an hour, going through Connor's and my experience in the mirror world, and then getting ready to leave and drive back to my house. It sounds just as insane as it did then typing this out. Our conversation on the drive back, with Connor in the driver's seat this time, was mostly filler or silence. As much as I didn't want to admit it because she was still helping us, Rebecca was not a great person to be around, and I could see why she'd be doing something so out of the ordinary, considering how apathetic she seemed to most people's emotions. And the second thing I was looking forward to the most after freeing myself of the other me's torment was not having to spend another second with her. After she gave us more information and theories about what we have to do, we came to the conclusion that we had to get rid of mine and Connor's double in order to sever our link to this reality, or dimension, or however you want to call it. We decided that we would do our best to destroy those of the 2 policemen who disappeared in response to the call if we found them. And I'm sorry if this makes me sound like a bad person, but I was not ready to spend more time in that hell of a place trying to save someone I didn't even know. And I just wanted it to be over already. And I think Rebecca was the only one who, despite all her supposed experience, failed to realize that we were literally about to enter another dimension to fight beings that were nothing close to human, when she urged us to make it our goal to find them as well. Arriving at my driveway was just as chilling as before, the eeriness amplified by the police car still outside. On our way, we'd passed by a store to buy a medium-sized mirror that we broke in order to arm ourselves with shards of its glass, an idea suggested by Rebecca that I was not sure how it made me feel when you take into account the superstitions around the bad luck that will follow you when you break a mirror. She seemed to not care and was more than happy to shatter it without a second thought, of course getting herself the longest and sharpest piece she could find, and leaving us with the shorter ones. We explained to Rebecca that going up into the attic is what sent both Connor and I into the other world, and he was the first to go up the ladder. Then Rebecca, and finally, myself. All 3 of us commented on the sudden chill and cold of the attic, and then slowly descended back into the hallway to find nothing out of the ordinary, until the first time our room repeated. But what was stranger than usual was how the distortions appeared almost instantaneously, with floating or half-missing furniture, misplaced windows, and the like. I can't believe I'm actually seeing this myself. For a change, this time Rebecca sounded like the one completely lost in the situation. I don't know about Connor, but it made me feel more in control, like I knew what to expect. Of course I didn't. Okay, listen to me. I tried to sound as confident as I could to grab their attention. I have an idea. We can walk all we want and expect to find one of those things, or we can draw them to us. While I was here, when I made a noise, they came almost instantly, so let's devise a plan. I looked around the room we were currently in. It was the kitchen, a perfect place for an ambush. I'd stay behind the counter by the window, looking towards the doorway, on either side of which Connor and Rebecca would wait with glass shards in hand to stab them into whatever creature came first. They agreed to the plan and took their positions while I looked into one of the shelves floating in the middle of the air, inside of which were small glass cups, not behind on defying the laws of physics. Looking back at the others and raising the cup in the air, they nodded in approval and I took a deep breath and braced myself, squeezing my shard in the other hand. Before I dropped the glass, I looked at the mark on my hand, which seemed to have grown to almost consuming my entire palm. We had to get this done, or who knows what would follow us. I simulated a pained yell as I threw the glass onto the ground, and seconds later, the all-too-familiar static and distant voices started storming towards the kitchen from the other room. Turning the corner was a man in a police uniform. I assume one of the two that were unlucky enough to be sent as the responders the night I got the call. It took all the strength in me not to flinch, as its what were up until now stiff movements turned into a feral sprint accompanied by a reverberating, inhuman growl. The moment that thing appeared through the doorway, Connor and Rebecca were swift to stab their shards into its body. Connor managed to slice into its abdomen while Rebecca jammed hers straight into its right eye. Moments later, the awful sound it somehow produced was cut like a TV turning off, and it began cracking until eventually shattering into pieces that littered the floor. The three of us looked at each other in disbelief. We just killed one of those things, and without it even being able to reach us. For the first time, I felt strong, triumphant, like I was going to be the one that they should be afraid of. That was short-lived. The only form of celebration we were able to have was momentary looks of widened eyes and smiles before the sounds returned. The footsteps, the screaming, the static. So many sets of footsteps, so much static. Rebecca gasped and Connor held his free hand up to his ear and shut his eyes tight while I backed away from the counter. In that moment of fear, I forgot about the broken window. Before I could see what was about to come through the door, I was pulled back by my hair so hard that for a second I thought my scalp was about to rip. I could only keep myself on my feet for less than 2 seconds, calling out for help before my spine slammed against the bottom frame of the window, and I went limp just long enough to be pulled into the bedroom it was looking into and thrown across half its length, rolling across the floor. I could hear the commotion in the kitchen the whole time. Rebecca screamed while Connor was silent, but I could hear objects being thrown into the walls and an occasional grunt that I assumed came from him. I did my best to stand up as quickly as possible, and that's when I realized my glass shard was gone. Likely I dropped it when I was grabbed. I opened my eyes to instantly be met with the sight of the other Marielle standing a few feet away from me, with her mouth open impossibly, revealing her entire bottom row of teeth but no tongue, and her eyes 2 different colors just like Connor had told me. She produced the same horrifying scream, but it wasn't mixed with any static. It sounded exactly like me, but as if I was being brutally torn apart, like I was being tortured in the most awful of ways possible. Looking around the bedroom, I realized there was nothing I could use as a weapon. By the time I did, the other Marielle had started her charge at me again, and I screamed, barely managing to slip past her and throw myself onto the bed. I reached for the pillow and through horrified, panicked inhales and exhales, I threw it at her, which, as you may imagine, was not a very effective weapon, and I crawled back, gasping as I fell over at the other side. Standing up as fast as I could, I was met with the awful sight of her crawling onto the bed like a spider. But that was not what disturbed me most. Her head, mouth still hanging open so painfully and eyes empty like a dark abyss. Her head was throwing itself into impossible angles, just like that thing pretending to be Connor had been doing so while I was hiding. I tried to make my way to the other corner of the room, but she pounced on me, pinning me to the ground, and with inhuman strength, she gripped my neck and lifted me up, slamming me into the wall. And as I looked into her, parts of her skin started going black. While I was still running, I heard the sound of glass shattering through the window. When the other Marielle had me pinned, I heard Connor shouting and a chair suddenly hit my double, and it released its grip on me. That moment allowed me to look into the kitchen and see Connor being tackled by his double and disappearing out of sight. And Rebecca was held against the wall by another creature in the skin of a police officer, but her hand was raised and she was holding her glass shard still. All she had to do was driving into its head and she would have freed herself, but that thing was too fast and stopped her arm midair with its own, squeezing so hard it caused her to drop the shard and scream in pain. All of this happening in less than a second. And then it dropped her arm and put its palm against her mouth. What I witnessed after that was the total disappearance of that thing's everything. It was just a totally black silhouette that resembled a human with impossibly uneven proportions, constantly swapping. But the only thing that stayed consistent was the arm with which it held onto Rebecca's mouth. Its palm then moved from just covering her mouth to grabbing her entire head, and she let out a guttural scream that only got louder and louder as it tightened its grip. I couldn't see anything more, as I still had the other me to deal with. While looking into the kitchen, an idea came to me. I could lure this Marielle towards the window and use its pieces of glass to shatter her. And that is what I did. I sprinted as fast as I could to the window and turned back to see she was already running for me. Her hands were out trying to grab me, and I ducked right before she was able to move to the right, causing her to ram in front of the window and into its frames. It was now or never. I turned around and gathered all the strength I had left to grab the other Mariel's head and slam it into the sharp piece of glass pointing right up. She was able to release one final shrink before it pierced into her left eye, and she stood there, frozen and silent. At that moment, I looked up to see what was happening inside the kitchen and saw that Rebecca had completely disappeared while Connor was still in a tussle with his double. I was just about to crawl through the window back to help before I was forced down on the floor by an awful, throbbing pain in my ankle, hand, and now neck, where the other Marielle had held me up. But the pain was soon to disappear, and I looked back up towards the window where my double was beginning to crack, and I called up for Connor one last time before she turned to pieces, and my memories end there. What I remember immediately after was waking up in a hospital bed with an IV going into my left hand, and I was covered by a sheet. I was so exhausted I could barely produce any sound that alerted a visitor I did not know I had sitting on a chair by the bed. "Easy, Marielle." The voice was that of a woman, and it would have certainly made me scream if I had the strength for it. "You've been out the longest out of us three." I slowly turned my head to see Rebecca smiling at me with this expression that had something off about it, but I choked it up to condition. "Rebecca? What happened?" "We did what we had to do is what happened. But you were completely out of it when we came out." I was too worried about Connor to ask what she meant by "came out." I was definitely in need of a memory freshener. Where's Connor? Is he okay?" "Oh yes, honey. Don't worry about him. He's in a neighboring room. You two had a real struggle in there." She then stood up, and at that moment I could not remember how she had suddenly disappeared while we were in that place. She made her way to the door and opened it, stepping out. "You'll have to ask the nurses if you can see him, though." "Wait, Rebecca!" I called out weakly. "How did we... Is it over?" "I'll tell you later, Marielle. Visiting time is over, and I need to feed Toby. You know he's probably starving by now. You know how much Frenchies eat." Before I could question her more, she shut the door, and I was left alone. For the first time, completely alone, and separated from Connor since he offered me his help. I was afraid for him, and I wanted to see him, but at least I had Rebecca's word that he was okay. I moved the covers to look at my hand and ankle. The parts where I had been marked were covered in bandages, and I had no idea what was under there. When I ran my other hand over the front of my neck, I confirmed that the case was the same with it too. I was sure that if they'd remained like that, I had a lot of explaining to do, and I wasn't sure how I was going to go about it. But I had the chance to finally rest, and I wasn't about to say no to it. Not long after, a male nurse entered my room with a tray of food and smiled under his mask. "Hello, miss. I was told you were awake. You were in quite the condition when we got to you. It was a stroke of luck your neighbors saw you before you lost too much blood." "Blood? What happened to me?" I recalled the black marks again and ran my hand over the bandages on my neck. "You had some really deep wounds where the bandages are, and your neighbor's son saw you passed out on the driveway bleeding. Poor kid, but he saved your life." "Is Connor here? Can I see him?" He was with me." The nurse looked at me confused and scratched his head. "Ma'am, there was no one with you, and we don't have a patient by that name in the ward." I raised my eyebrows and felt myself begin to tense. "That's impossible. He was with me. Check again, please. I was with 2 other people, that lady and Connor. Please just check again." "Okay, ma'am, okay. Just don't stress yourself out, please. You really need to rest and keep yourself steady. I'll be back in just a few moments." He smiled and nodded at me before turning around and leaving the room, but I was too nervous for pleasantries right now. I started to wonder why Rebecca was in such a rush and why she'd lie about Connor if he wasn't here. I'd remembered by now how she suddenly went missing while I was still inside that place, but I thought that just like how I'd returned to the real world after I killed the other me, the same thing must have happened to her. But there wasn't another her, right? That's when I replayed our conversation over a few times in my head, the one we had before she left, and I kept stopping at one detail in particular. Was I misremembering it? Or did she get the name of her dog wrong?